So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was, in the past you've talked about consent, and there's different levels of consent. So there's a consent of you meet somebody new and you want to be a kink partner to them, so you go over a list of what's allowable, what's not allowable, what you're into, what you're not into. So that's one level of consent. But when you enter into a deeper relationship with somebody and there is a BDSM kink element to it, then you've also in the past pointed out in your book as well about how at that point the entire kink needs a story and there needs to be a meaning to the dynamic as well. And that has important implications for consent as well. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, let's start at the basic level, and then we'll move into the more sophisticated psychological stuff you brought up. One is, if I meet a girl and not compatible for a relationship, we know that for some reason ahead of time, however we know that. But she's cute enough, I'm cute enough, we're going to play casually, whatever the deal is. So we fill out some BDSM checklist, we figure out what things we both like, and we do those things. So if I'm into spanking, she's into being spanked, I'm into bondage, she's into being tied up. But if I'm into humiliation and she's not, and I'm into whatever, gags, and she's not, then we don't do those things. We stick to the spanking and bondage that we're both into. And that's simple. Now, in a relationship, that's a bit of a problem, because if I'm really into humiliation and she's not, then my need is unmet in that relationship. That depends on what kind of need it is. If I only need it once every 10 years, well, I could probably live without. But if that's, as it is for me, humiliation play is probably one of my core kinks. That's one of the biggest aspects of the kink play that I enjoy. That's going to be a problem because it's going to come up every time we want to have sex. And so now, yes, we're doing the bondage and the spanking, but what we're not doing becomes a problem. That gap becomes a problem. And it leads to a different need, a different set of negotiations is, how do we handle the situation when what I want and what you want are different? Are we just incompatible? That's the point at which we break up? Or is there, which, then you have to meet someone who perfectly meets you, every one of your kinks. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, on a deeper level, which you alluded to, so we'll go the next layer deeper, is not only does she have to be into spanking, but she has to, on some level, be into spanking for the same reason I'm into spanking. We have to be telling the same story about the spanking, which makes it even harder on some level, because if she's into spanking because she just likes the sensation, and I'm into spanking because it's humiliating for her to be put over my lap and given a spanking like a naughty little girl, those are different stories. We're doing different things. And in a friends with benefits, maybe I'll just keep my mouth shut and I'll be thinking privately in my head one thing and she'll be thinking something else, and it's fine. We're both getting our rocks off. But in a relationship, that doesn't work. You have to be able to interweave your stories. And so I do think it's a bit of a challenge. I'm sure you're feeling the same thing, of finding someone who's trying to tell the same stories you're trying to tell, or at least compatible stories.
I will say that one of the things that I took away from your book when you showed me the early draft about a year ago is how kink was very identity forming, in that if you are in it really deeply with a person that you are in a committed relationship with, and both the thing is also important to make it clear to people who are listening, is a lot of the times when we're talking about relationships and kink, both I think me and you have a predilection for wanting to be in committed relationships, right? We're not, there is not really a channel about people who are like going to munches all the time or having orgies or anything like that, right? So the idea...
I mean, what's an orgy here or there between friends? That's
well, the idea is that...
I don't want to speak disparagingly of those things, because people are trying to meet their partner, they're trying to explore, they're trying to whatever. But yes, I think you and I, at least for ourselves, idealize the commitment and the depth, I think, that can't be explored without that commitment.
Maybe I should rephrase it another way, is that when I read the book, I realized that, BDSM and kink was never about the sex to begin with, and that there was something much deeper and richer to be obtained, right? And that depth really was where a lot of your identity forming lay as well, right? Because I think I've said this to you in the past is when you are in a relationship like that with somebody, when you are kinky like that with somebody, you are being witnessed as a certain kind of, in a certain kind of circumstance or perspective relative to the other person. And it really requires that witnessing of another person, right, in your role that consolidates and validates that role, right? So if you are a dom and you are being treated as a dom by a sub, you are both mutually reinforcing that identity with each other. And so obviously when it's a deeper relationship as opposed to someone you're just meeting in a munch or a bar or just a very casual thing, then consent becomes a lot more important because even when we're not having sex, right? What are the rules? What are we agreeing to be to each other outside of sex? If we are, first of all, if we're deciding to take it outside of sex, which most people, if they're looking at it with this level of intensity and depth, do decide to take it outside the bedroom. It's hard to turn that off if you're really into it. And then there's a whole level of consent that needs to be negotiated about who am I to you and who are you to me and what responsibilities do you have to me as your dom and vice versa. And then those are very involved conversations that have nothing to do with whether you like to be tickled or hot wax, or it's a very different kind of consent. And I think that's what you were pointing to when you'd raised this issue in some of our prior conversations about this.
I mean, absolutely. And I think a lot of those things get into pretty difficult things. I had a really interesting conversation recently that she was saying that she had maybe on some level wanted submissive experience, but didn't believe that it was possible. Didn't believe it was possible to trust someone that much. Didn't believe it was possible to find someone who was dominant in those ways. And so it felt very much like a fantasy. Not something to really be engaged in. And that struck me partly because I never felt that way. I had these fantasies, and a large part of my mindset was, well, how do I make this real? And it's interesting how it made me wonder how many women read about these things. I mean, most romance novels essentially have BDSM elements. They may not call it that, there may not be any spanking, and there may not be any whatever.
Pretty Woman is a great example. Early BDSM,
sure,
kinky, the process.
And even the notions of possession, the notions of your mind. Every vampire novel has a possessive element of your mind, of ownership, of whatever. And there's a ton of impulse there. And the more explicit it gets, the more niche it gets, because women are willing to go along the more explicit the BDSM goes. Now, 50 Shades of Grey is an interesting exception to that, partly because it framed BDSM as inherently shameful or problematic, and that allowed women to engage with the conflict within their own minds, along with the eroticism. And so it hit just the right note of telling Beauty and the Beast as a story where his beastliness was the BDSM, which is an interesting framing on it. Is he was the wealthy, beautiful young prince, but turned into a beast by these BDSM kinky desires. One of the interesting, sorry, this is a brief aside, but I have to mention this. A meme I came across recently showed that scene from Beauty and the Beast, the cartoon, where they're dancing in the ballroom, and it's pointed out, it said, hey, interesting fact, Belle had no idea that he was going to turn into a prince and was fully prepared to bang him as was. And what's even more interesting about that...
The real moral of the story.
The real moral of the story. But what's more interesting about that is I have yet to meet a woman who did not feel that the prince was a bit of a letdown and preferred the beast as a beast. And in fact, they made a follow-up movie where he had to go back to being a beast because the prince was missing all the things that the women were responding to in a lot of ways, that beastly nature, which is part of why the mythology of Beauty and the Beast works so well. All of which is to tie back to 50 Shades. He kept the beastliness, he kept the kinkiness, even after the romance had settled, in a way that Beauty and the Beast did not. A lot of women feel a little slightly betrayed when he turns into the prince because they're losing something that they value there, which is interesting. Anyway, That's an aside. I do think, going back to your core point of like identity formation, in some ways you can call it identity formation or identity reclamation. I think that if you take a young woman who has slutty desires, she has a libido, she has sexual impulses, but that's frowned on in society. Well, who is going to see her as she truly is? Who is going to let her embody that slut and not judge, not throw it back in her face when they have an argument later? That's an important aspect of a committed relationship is, hey, if we're really going to be seen as we are with each other, when you get mad at me, are you going to call me a tyrant and shame the rules that we enjoyed previously? Or am I going to shame you for being slutty? That breaks the rules, that breaks the trust. And those become really important aspects, one important aspect of a committed relationship. The same is true of trust, is you have to trust me a lot to let me tie you up. You have to trust me a lot to follow my lead in certain ways. And that kind of trust, I think, is foreign to a lot of women because they haven't met a lot of men who upheld a moral code with rigor. And without that framework, BDSM as an actual enacted reality becomes pretty hard to fathom.